both the benefit and the challenge of common heritage is that it is open-ended. It can mean different things to different peoples. The benefit of having an open-ended concept is also that today we can again reevaluate it and reinterpret it in light of today's knowledge and realities. But it doesn't tell you an awful lot until you zoom in on how it's actually put into practice.
Welcome to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining podcast. Rozemarijn Roland Holst. Did I get that close to right?
That's close to right, yes. Thanks for having me.
I feel like being North American, I just butcher all of the variety of names that come up in Europe. Yeah. Thanks for joining the podcast. Roze is a lecturer in international environmental law at the University of Edinburgh. Your work focuses on ocean governance, deep sea mining law, and environmental decision-making. You've published on the legal framework of the ISA, on the concept of the common heritage of mankind, which is what I'm interested in talking to you about today. And you were legal counsel to the Commission of Small Island States in the advisory proceedings on climate change before the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea and the International Court of Justice. Anything else that you want to tell people about yourself?
Oof, that sounds about right. Yeah, all things ocean and climate and environment and where they intersect. That's what I'm interested in.
Okay, you had published something on the common heritage of mankind principle that also kind of brought up the concept of trade-offs. And so people who listen to this podcast would know that I'm very interested in how we make decisions which involve trade-offs across different value categories. And I don't think I've had anybody yet on this podcast who can kind of specifically lay out this common heritage of mankind concept and the history of it. And it seems like that's something that you're very familiar with. So that's what I hope we're going to talk about. But before we get there, do you have a hook? Do you have an elevator pitch? If anybody only listens to the first 5 minutes of this, what message do you want them to take away?
I would say that the deep seabed and the question of deep seabed mining is a fascinating sort of test case, a laboratory, if you will, for quite significant questions of how we relate to our living planet. It is an area where I think some of the biggest questions of our time all intersect, whether that is cumulative human pressures, climate change on a very dynamic, fragile, complex environment, how we deal with big unknowns, uncertainty, questions around energy transition, and what extractivism should look like in that future, and how the decisions we make around that today will impact future generations. So if we pivot back to that concept of common heritage of humankind, which is how the deep seabed is legally designated, that's a really interesting question of, well, whose heritage is it? All of us. So in theory, we are all participants in the debate of what that should look like, and ask critical questions of, well, whose heritage is it? Who benefits? Who bears the costs? And quite uniquely in this context, we actually have a political forum, the International Seabed Authority, a legal structure and an institutional structure where, for all their flaws, which I'm sure we'll get to, we can have these debates and before exploitation actually commences. So for all the challenges that I'm sure all your listeners are well aware of, we also have an opportunity here to tackle this question in a way that hopefully does not reproduce the environmental and social injustices that we see in so many other contexts and extractive industries today.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this is one of the interesting aspects of deep sea mining is that in some ways it's like a little crystalline test case of so many other environmental problems. And then it has this additional aspect that makes it almost more theoretical than other problems, in that there is a designated one, and then each country also has these kind of decision-making bodies, and there's decisions that are actually happening ahead of time as opposed to arguing over things kind of post hoc. So yeah, I agree that deep sea mining, even for people who aren't super interested in seabed minerals, is a super interesting theoretical, philosophical issue for environmentalism. And yeah, and your work seems to combine a bunch of different, what I think of as kind of like fields. You seem to talk about social theory and economic theory and history, but all the while you are a legal scholar and you're writing about the kind of the concrete legal aspects of this. So tell me what hat you wear in your research. How do you think about the siloing between disciplines and whether you're allowed to research in different disciplines and how you approach that?
Yeah, this is probably the most difficult question you're going to ask me today. It's quite an existential one. So my training is entirely in law. My PhD was in law of the sea. So that's where my disciplinary footing is. However, what I'm really interested in is what law does in the world, almost law as a social practice, law in context, it's sometimes called. And in order to understand that, it makes no sense to look at law as this thing that magically arises from a page and then is, right? Law is put into practice, it's interpreted, it does things. It also reflects all sorts of ideas and debates and ideologies before it even ended up on a page. So if you want to understand what law does, and I'm particularly interested in how it reflects and mediates human relationships with the natural world, with resources, with our environment, whether that's local or global environments like the deep seabed, you inevitably start up reading around that much more broadly. And I've always read very widely just because I was often more interested in that than reading law books. And that bleeds over in my research. So I think the boundaries are blurred. I really cross, honestly, from anthropology to science and technology studies across the humanities and bits of law and sociology. I would not consider myself an expert in any of those fields, but I think where you find scholars, and often they tend to be interdisciplinary scholars as well, that are interested in the same problems or phenomena, you find commonality. So I think the sort of the theoretical grounding of my work tends to straddle those fields, and then I often have a sort of more concrete hook into a legal problem or a legal application or a context where it shows what the law then does. So I guess I'm a lawyer with an aversion to silos and a selection of hats.
Yeah, I like what you say about how the law integrates with so many aspects of society, which is something that I notice. So I kind of have the same issue. I'm trying to look at this from a very philosophical perspective and engage with kind of like what the philosophy silo has to say about deep sea mining. I mean, for one thing, deep sea mining is super interdisciplinary, or at least anyone who talks about it is always bringing in issues from a bunch of different aspects. The economic and the environmental and the legal are all getting mixed in, and the social all the time. And from the philosophical discipline, I often look over at the legal discipline and think, you guys have to do this, but much more concretely. The complaint that I often have about what philosophers do is they like float off into the abstract and leaving real money on the table in terms of like, you've looked at an issue, you've analyzed the values, you've analyzed the competing interests, but then you're not taking the next step. And then I look over at, in law, you do have to take the next step and implement. And I think that it would be a super interesting field to be in, because you're dealing with the philosophical and social problems, but having to make them concrete. One more background question is just like, how long have you been in the deep sea mining discussion, and how do you experience it in terms of being a polarized and controversial place? Is it frustrating? Is it extra interesting? Is it actually the same as any other discipline that people focus on? It's just that those of us who focus on deep sea mining feel like it's more controversial than other, spaces.
Yeah, so I think the first, or when I started to do more of a deep dive into it, was actually as part of my PhD, which I started some 10 years ago now. And my PhD was on change in the law of the sea. So basically I was looking at areas where the treaty that we have, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, which was negotiated during the 70s, is able or not to still accommodate some of the drastically changed circumstances and realities that it is applied to today, climate change being an obvious one. But I was also looking at deep seabed mining as something that was foreseen as a part of the convention that would evolve, but where obviously our understanding, knowledge, technology has come on leaps and bounds since the 70s. And I was quite interested in the discussions around it, which I must say at the time felt much more like as quite a small echo chamber with two sides mostly shouting at each other. It is polarized. It also had the sort of out of sight, out of mind element. It was really niche. So it was either industry, a handful of lawyers, and maybe a handful of marine biologists that had some understanding of this space, where nobody would encounter that in the day to day. And we can't go out there to have a look for ourselves, at least not most of us. So the discussion was quite closed, or it felt quite closed. And I think in recent years it has opened up significantly, probably due to a combination of factors, the moratorium movement gaining more power, more media attention as well, civil society and also indigenous voices really making concerted efforts to participate in this conversation, even if not formally, then by being there in Jamaica or making their voices heard. So I think the debate has diversified, and I think that's really important. But still, if I have a classroom of students from all over the world who study international law, so these are postgraduate students with an interest in international law, I often do a little poll and ask, how many of you have heard of the International Seabed Authority, and do you know what it does? And I think on average, in a room of 30 plus people, 2 or 3 hands go up, which is interesting to me. So I think there's a lot of value in this debate being more accessible, more transparent, and more open. So yes, it is controversial, and the controversy will not be resolved, but I think that broader range of voices and knowledges being engaged in the debate is really important if we are to crack this nut, so to say.
I think it's interesting to be reminded of how niche this is and how little attention most normies give it. Because this is something that, especially as I'm spending more and more time talking to people like you who are well-versed in this, it just feels like there's more common knowledge. I gain common knowledge about deep-sea mining. I just assume that the rest of the world is kind of like me and has some background knowledge in this. So it's interesting that even people in an international law class have a very low exposure to the topic. Then let's get into why I brought you here, which is to explain the concept of the common heritage. What does that mean? Where it came from, what it was supposed to do, what it has done, and then talk a little bit about what it currently does or should hopefully do. So start wherever you want to with that.
Yeah, so maybe we'll start with where it came from, because its history is quite a fascinating one, and it has lived a few lives already, you could say. So the concept really was put on the table as an alternative model to the legal frameworks that were available and applicable at that time. So we're talking 60s. This was when many states were just gaining independence. It was also a time of great sort of scientific and technological optimism. And the man who sort of put the seabed as common heritage of humankind on the international agenda was Arvid Pardo, Maltese ambassador, who made in 1967 a speech to the General Assembly, a good old day-long speech, as you could do at the time. And he made a number of points. So his core proposal was to designate the deep seabed as common heritage of humankind. He had not come up with that concept as such. That was sort of floating around in various circles, but he really combined it with the deep seabed and put that solidly on the agenda. And his argument was that there were unparalleled riches basically waiting there on the ocean floor to be scooped up. And he really leaned into that optimism, even citing Arthur Clarke, the science fiction writer, at some point, with visions of like ocean mining and ocean farming and whatnot. So his message was, this wealth is immeasurable and we may very well soon be able to exploit this. But he also combined that with a warning. And this really spoke to the sort of anxieties of the day and the agendas of newly independent states, whose resources up to then, of course, had been extracted from them to the benefit of the colonial center and had now gained independence, with which comes sovereignty and sovereign rights over your own natural resources within your jurisdiction. At sea, we had areas beyond national jurisdiction that were at the time still subject to the freedoms of the high seas regime, which meant that all states had the freedom of access and use of those resources. At that time, it was mostly fisheries because we were not extracting minerals from the deep seabed yet. But that regime also applied to the deep seabed. So what Pardo foreshadowed and warned for was this sort of new land grab that was going to head out to the deep, where, of course, the more technologically and economically advanced states, the industrialized states, would beat everyone to it and take the biggest share of the pie. With potential of environmental damage and so on as well. So his proposal was to halt that, pause that, designate that deep seabed as common heritage of humankind, and set up a new international regime to manage that, including a central authority that would manage that on behalf of the international community. Now, that really gained traction. The General Assembly proceeded to adopt a number of resolutions, including a moratorium resolution that said no activities, no mining there until this new regime has been negotiated and agreed. They also adopted a set of deep seabed principles, which included common heritage of humankind as the sort of the legal bucket in which that would sit. And that work then carried over and actually was a big kickstarter for what became the negotiations of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, as a whole.
Let me pause you there for a second, because I feel like some of that ground is worth going over in terms of, you're not the first person on the podcast to mention that the concept of the common heritage of mankind was kind of birthed into a environment of optimism, and where the main message around the ocean was abundance. And this, I think, is super interesting. And I'm sure I've said this multiple times before, is that it's just so interesting. Now, I think our default view on the ocean and the environment is scarcity. And we think, yeah, we have to have this common heritage of mankind principle or something like that, because there's only so much out there and it needs to be, when the pie is only so big, it has to be shared equitably. Whereas it sounds like the issue was much more, there's this huge pie out there, and we're not really worried about running out of pie. We're worried about the people who are first to the table just taking and taking and taking. And this was also, very much in the context of this very recent history of colonialism, which we talk a lot about these days, but I think back then had a much more concrete resource exploitation memory for people. So I think those things are just very interesting to keep in mind. Like, that was the mindset of a lot of the people at the time.
Yeah, and I think it's good. Well, two things. It shows how sort of public imagination and thinking blends in to ideas about how to organize and govern things. And the other was that a lot of this was misinformed. So some of the figures that he relied on, Pardo, in his speech were just fantasy. And were not so long after, in the next decade, debunked or put into question. But nevertheless, as a framing, it was very effective, because it really put that urgency on the map, and it really managed to mobilize states behind the need for a governance regime before whatever this was going to be opened up, this sort of treasure chest. So it shows how knowledge of places and resources and risks and benefits really shapes how we think about their management. And that then sets into motion certain legal structures. But of course, that knowledge over time changes. And that's what we see again today, when we're still working with some of the same concepts, but with a better understanding of what actually is happening down there and what actually exists there. This was also still a time when they thought it was just dark, muddy abyss, right, with no life.
There was nothing but treasure on the floor of the ocean. One more thing before I kind of let you move on to how that concept developed is this really was the first domain where common heritage was so clearly articulated. Like, it's not obvious to me that minerals on the seafloor would be the place where this idea of some things belonging to all of humanity would take shape. There's other instances of things that don't belong to anybody and therefore should maybe belong to everybody. But for some reason, this was like the first time that was an articulable, at least legal concept, I assume.
Yeah, that's right. It was also an area, a space that was still sort of open to legal designation, or at least the choice was made to remove it from that freedom of the high seas, which used to apply to pretty much everything except a narrow strip of territorial sea that grew over time. Actually, as states' capacity to exploit it grew, they sort of claimed more and more. And common heritage, we find it only in one other instrument of international law, and that's the Moon Agreement, which is also the sort of 70s post-Cold War instrument, which designates the moon and resources on the moon and other celestial bodies as common heritage of humankind. But that treaty has been ratified only by a handful of states. So that means only a handful of states are bound by it, none of the major spacefaring nations. So that is kind of moot. It's not very effective, and it certainly hasn't developed into anything like the regime that we have for the deep seabed. And interestingly, one other context where it was brought to the table was in the 80s in discussions around Antarctica, when there was some pushback around this handful of claimant states that were managing Antarctica. Well, they would say in the interest of everyone, other states would say in their own interest. And some developing states pushed there to designate Antarctica as common heritage as well, which never took off, but there was a move to try and...
What are the alternatives to common heritage? Is it just, it's either common heritage or kind of finders keepers? Are those like essentially the two ways that you can go?
Yeah, so prior to the seabed being designated as common heritage, your two flavors were really territorial sovereignty. So that basically treats, for example, the territorial sea of a state as its land. So any resources that you find in there are subject to, the state, and they can do whatever they want with them, subject to any obligations that they've contracted into or bound by under international law. And then beyond that, you had the freedoms regime of the high seas, which meant all states could access and use it, again, subject to some obligations that have grown over time. But that's basically an open access regime. So everyone can take a share of the pie. So common heritage was a way to remove this resource from those two options and find a centralized way of administrating it, really with an emphasis on benefit sharing, at least originally. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Then tell me about benefit sharing, because I think that's the other term that people hear associated with common heritage. And so what does it mean? And did it came along at the same time as the common heritage? Those things have always been attached?
Yeah, the ideas have always been attached. States could agree quite quickly on designating the seabed as common heritage of humankind. But then, of course, the question is, well, how does that work in practice? How do you actually operationalize that? How do you actually organize access and use of these resources? And then suddenly you can have 100 different visions of what common heritage actually looks like. So the proof really is in the details here. And this is where, over the course of the negotiations of the Law of the Sea Convention, which took almost 10 years, you really see camps and shifts forming. So mostly developing and newly independent states at that time were rallying behind this agenda for a new international economic order. This idea that huge equity and economic imbalances could be solved by a different way of organizing the international economic order. And the deep seabed regime became one of their flagship policies where they were going to push this agenda. So this is again in that wake of newly acquired sovereignty over natural resources. They also wanted fair access and a share in the resources beyond national jurisdiction. So that meant that for them in the seabed regime, what was most important was direct access and participation, which took the shape of the enterprise, which was a sort of mining arm of the ISA that would actually be an international industry, so it would actually do the mining.
Yeah, I wonder how many people, even in deep sea mining, really know about this. This is something that I'd heard about, but never actually turned my mind to until recently, is that there was essentially a monopolistic company proposed to do all the mining.
Yeah. essentially. And it still exists on paper, and there's a way to sort of revive it. But it was shelved when the implementing agreement was agreed, which I'm sure we'll come to. But that direct participation was really important to them because those states, of course, would not necessarily have the technology and the capital to start an industry like that themselves. Benefit sharing was another really important one. Transfer of technology, different sort of protections and caps for existing land-based producers of those minerals. So all sorts of mechanisms to manage the equity and the actual access and participation in this new industry if it were to start. And they were quite successful. So, of course, these are negotiations, so you always get compromises, but to a degree, they managed to get some of their demands into the negotiating text throughout the course of the 70s. The main tensions there were with mostly industrialized Western states who, of course, on a much more sort of neoliberal agenda of market access, were trying to ensure easy and early access by private corporations under their jurisdiction to this new regime. So that meant pushing back against some of those more centralized policies, much more of an emphasis on market mechanisms rather than sort of central administration and all the costs that come with that, of course. And that tension really came to a head and kind of flipped from 1980, especially when Reagan was elected and the US and others really took issue with the draft of the seabed regime as it stood at the time, and were just not willing to buy into it. So that actually became the final sort of stumbling block. And it was clear that even though the text was finally agreed, they were not going to sign this new convention, which, you know, as a constitution for the ocean, required widespread participation. So this was a real issue, that final sort of quarrel over the deep seabed regime wasn't resolved. So a next round of negotiations were started in the 80s trying to find a new compromise on this. And that eventually led to what we call the 1994 implementing agreement, which basically amends the original Part 11 of UNCLOS on deep seabed mining. So now you have the funny situation that you read the two texts together, and wherever there's a discrepancy, the implementing agreement prevails. So what remains unchanged is that it's common heritage of humankind. The environmental protection obligations remain in place. They were never controversial. But what the implementing agreement really carved out were all those protections that basically the developing world fought for. So it shelved the enterprise. It redistributed some decision-making powers within the ISA as well, more in the favor of industrialized states. It scrapped mandatory transfer of technology and various protections for land-based producers. So it really hollowed out those aspects that were part and parcel of that new economic order agenda to make way for a much more market-based regime.
How much is the Cold War the context to look at this through, that this was a time where there was the ideological conflict between free market and centralization, and so much of these instruments that you're talking about require some sort of administrative control? And so was it that they had a problem with disseminating knowledge and bringing in developing states and the equity aspect, or was it that they had a problem with the kind of fact that these things were antithetical to the free market, just bluntly? And so at that time, I imagine anything that smacked of socialism was going to be given a hard time, regardless of whether it was in the interest of a state that already had a lot of power or developing states that were looking for power. There was also just this additional dimension of free market versus centralization. Yeah,
I think those were definitely the dividing lines in the Cold War context against which this played out was hugely influential. I think there's quotes from like American diplomats that especially something like the enterprise and international industry, of course, smelled of international socialism. So that's a huge part. Something that changed during that time as well was that initial sort of optimism and, this is such a big pool of wealth and it's quite easily accessible. That was a narrative that was still being fed to some developing states. At the same time, the sort of actual practicalities of this starting soon as an industry were becoming increasingly remote. So over time, that sort of urgency ebbed away a little bit. I think there was a combination of factors. Also, sort of culturally, there's interesting work that describes how different states would look at something that's basically a common property regime. For states that have cultures of communal property, so where both the benefit and the responsibility for looking after this communal property is shared, look at something like common heritage from that lens. Whereas those Western industrialized states that we're talking about with a very much individualistic, possessive idea around property and the competition that entails, look at that from a fundamentally different starting point. So I think there's a whole mix of factors that blend into the very different interpretations of that regime that you can give. Ultimately, this gave way to, well, there was, I think, two main factors. That sort of neoliberal market idea was starting to just become convincing to a broader range of states. There was also, a framing of the public interest in common heritage being equated to economic development, which the easiest way to get to that is to open this up to market actors, if you philosophy. So that became bundled. And the other thing was that everyone could agree on the need for UNCLOS to enter into force with as wide possible participation they could get. So the need to get a compromise on this part of the regime, so as to not compromise everything else that this new convention does, added some urgency and pragmatic sort of welly behind sorting this out so that other parts of the convention as a whole could enter into force. So I think that and various other factors that enabled the implementing agreement ultimately to come into place. But yeah, that marks quite a shift in the sort of the journey of common heritage and its various
I think
possible implementations.
Two of those threads are, to me, interesting to keep separate. One is the idea of private property being the best way to manage a commons, and Garrett Harding in The Tragedy of the Commons kind of mindset that has been, as far as I understand, has kind of been just taken as a natural law up until at least recently, with some alternative social science from Alan Ross and others saying, there does exist other ways to manage a commons that doesn't involve just privatization. But it used to be that was just kind of seen to be the best way to deal with some of the problems that arise with trying to get a bunch of people to collaborate over a shared resource. And then what do you define as the common benefit? And you kind of say that is eventually it got to be equated with economic growth. If we can make decisions that grow the entire economic pie, then we can call that benefit to humanity. And that makes sense through a very utilitarian logic. And this is something that I struggle with still in trying to tease apart different sort of philosophical theories, is how do you look at grouping together the interests of a whole bunch of individual people without defaulting to just summing up the individual interests. And if that overall picture grows, then that's the common interest. And so, but is there anything more to say there about what the alternative is to that utilitarian picture? Like, are there practical alternatives to how you define benefit, or is it just that also was the most easily operationable?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two layers there. First is how you organize access, and the sort of analogy to property under international law would be sovereignty and sovereignty over natural resources, or an open access regime, and that would be closer to your freedoms of the high seas. It's not entirely open access. There's some ifs and buts and obligations. Or common heritage would say, no, nobody can actually go in and appropriate these resources. It's centrally managed by the ISA. And then the law, the convention in this case, says that the ISA shall ensure that activities in the area, which is kind of code for deep seabed mining, shall be conducted to the benefit of humankind as a whole, which is great, but it doesn't specify. The law doesn't say what is benefit. And then, of course, you can come to very different valuations or ideas of what benefit means, especially if you look at the broader mandate of the ISA, which is not just open up this industry, it's also protect the deep seabed from the negative impacts, the harms of seabed mining, and distribute the benefits from exploitation equitably among the international community. So all of those are goods, are public goods, are part of its mandate that it needs to look at. But I think we can already feel that those are in tension with each other. So if you prioritize one, you compromise the other. And this is where we're basically that nut wasn't cracked by either the Convention or the Implementing Agreement. So that became part of the job of the ISA and the regulations that it's still in the process of developing, to find a way of implementing those various aspects of its mandate in a set of regulations that either try to balance or trade off those aspects, or others would say, well, that's just impossible. There's no such thing as sustainable deep seabed mining. You can't do all of these three things at the same time. But that's, I think, where the debate is around now, and the different views on how to weigh those various aspects. Include there are other benefits that maybe we've come aware of in recent times, other values, other more knowledge of what's out there and the benefits of that broader ecosystem, or the benefits of the deep seabed for cultural and spiritual ties from certain nations. So benefit remains, I think, disputed and open to interpretation, but something that we legally need to protect. So that's where I think it's such an interesting hook that we have that in law, and you can center arguments around that of what that should look like.
Right. So yeah, and so it wasn't actually kind of codified that benefit would equate to global economic growth or anything. You were telling about how in the 94, was that the implementing agreement?
Mm-hmm.
If I understood you, that there's a shift to accepting growth as a definition for benefit, or as an evaluating criteria, and that helped to bring more consensus around this thing, which everybody recognized was super important. We need to get some principles that we can at least agree on enough that we can get enough states to sign on so that we can have this actually mean something.
Yeah, I think it was a shift to believing in that the market would generate the largest amount of benefit, which would then somehow pay into the piggy bank of the ISA as well, which would then devise a mechanism to distribute that. But that was very much the rationale behind many of those provisions that we have. It doesn't legally specify what benefit is.
Yeah.
But the ethos, the rationale was that market mechanisms would open up this industry in the most efficient, effective way, leading to maximum proceeds for the ISA to then distribute to the international community.
Interesting. I'm tempted to ask you if you have on the top of your head any specifics there, like where do they put in a market mechanism?
Oh, it's diffuse. It's all these. So it's shelving the enterprise as an option. It made it easier for private corporations to get access to areas. It set up maybe the site banking system that maybe you've discussed on the podcast, where basically a contractor who gets an exploration contract, so this is exploration phase, will put aside an area of equivalent estimate value to the ISA. It's sort of banked, and then the convention still says that developing states will get a sort of right of first refusal. They will get privileged access to those banked areas because it makes access a little bit easier. Which, of course, in practice, you see that means that developing states become attractive sponsoring states for private entities that, well, in most instances that we have, are incorporated again in states like the Global North. This is what you saw with TMC and Nauru, for example, that then private corporations can make use of that sort of preferential access to get access to those sites. That's one example. Also in the decision-making structures within the ISA, power was effectively shifted away from the assembly, which is like the plenary body with all member states, to the council, which is a smaller membership and quite a complicated system of chamber voting. So basically less democratic. So there was various across the whole regime, various tweaks that in effect leveraged power towards the industrialized states and made it easier for private corporations to get access to this.
Okay, well, I thought that would be maybe too difficult a question, but you've got lots of specifics that you can tie in. Then I guess take us past 1994. Like, what has happened with common heritage since? Does it continue to develop? What's the modern status on this?
Yeah, so then the ISA basically set to working away at the regulations for the prospecting and exploration phase, which we've had for some time now. And really what I think really kickstarted the discussion sort of back into light was when the work on the exploitation phase, started, which is still ongoing. And especially in recent years, as the awareness of environmental risk has grown, there's been, strong voices from scientific communities saying, whoa, there's a lot more to this. We need to think about this carefully. The moratorium movement came up. At the other end, you had the pressure tactics from certain industry players, the trigger of the 2-year deadline a few years ago. That on the one end put the pressure on, we need to finalize the regulations for the exploitation phase. And at the other end underlined the huge amount of work, unknowns, and the complexity of trying to put these sort of 3 pillars, so facilitating an industry, exploitation, commercial exploitation, protecting the marine environment, and generating and distributing benefit into a set of regulations that achieves all those things satisfactorily and that everyone can agree on. I think has opened up these conversations of actually what does and should common heritage look like today? What is benefit? How much compromise of the one over the other are we willing to accept? Do we even have the knowledge to make those decisions at this point in time? And that's basically where we are today. I think that's all being reevaluated in light of today's knowledge as well, compared to back in the 70s when this was last a big thing. Yeah.
So very much still under debate. Like that was my understanding, I guess, before talking to you, was that this is something that is a key, it's kind of a central aspect of what the ISA has to do, and it still has yet to do it. One last thing, I guess it's worth mentioning, correct me if I'm wrong, that this common heritage of mankind was also, has also been kind of brought up in the BBNJ, that they've also kind of said that other marine resources from international waters are also common heritage of mankind, not just mineral resources.
Correct. Yeah. So what is now the BBNJ agreement is another implementing agreement under UNCLOS. So it fills a few gaps that the convention left. In this case, it concerned marine genetic resources, marine biodiversity that's not commercially fished fish or mineral resources, but that's in the high seas, and how do we manage sustainable use and conservation of those mostly genetic resources? That's mostly the extractive interest there. And in those negotiations, again, you saw that fault line roughly across developing states, where certainly initially the developing world thought this is an opportunity to also designate those resources as common heritage of humankind, whereas roughly developed states were arguing, no, the freedoms-based regime is fine, and we would just put more detailed regulations in place of how we use and conserve these resources. And what we've ended up with is a kind of a sort of a hybrid, a mix of the two things. Common heritage of humankind is mentioned as a guiding principle in the BBNJ agreement. And then one element thereof, which is a benefit sharing mechanism, is put into place for marine genetic resources as well. Remains to be developed. There's much to be fleshed out. But that element of it has got a place in the BBNJ agreement now as well.
Yeah, so the BBNJ is similar in that way too. I get confused between where UNCLOS and the BBNJ, because the BBNJ is part of UNCLOS. But
yeah, I think UNCLOS as an umbrella, and there's bits that hang under it to add more detail to plug some holes in the umbrella.
Interesting. So if you catch a fish in the high seas and international waters, if you sell the fish, then you have kind of private property rights over that. But if you do something with the genetic resources of the fish, which to me is still somewhat vague, then that's common heritage.
Not exactly. So the marine genetic resources are not designated as common heritage of humankind. It just has it as a guiding principle. So this is one of these legal compromises where states, they could not agree on designated as common heritage. It remains subject to the freedoms-based regime, but with an additional set of procedures and obligations of how you manage those resources. And then commercially fished fisheries are managed by other pre-existing fisheries law. So it's like a patchwork of different regimes that deal with different bits of this. But yeah, under a freedoms-based regime, all states have freedoms of fishing. If you take the fish, it's your fish. In the deep seabed, the way to appropriate things is to get a license from the ISA. If you're a contractor, you get sponsorship from a state, you get a contract from the ISA. Provided you do that, if you then lift off the minerals, they become your property as well. But the access regime is organized differently. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And then you have obligations to pay a fee to the ISA.
Once you lift the minerals, they're your minerals, but there's going to be some sort of benefit sharing aspect to be added on to that. But it's not exactly the same as those minerals are common heritage. Once they're lifted, then they're much more in a normal commercial.
Yeah, then they're appropriated. Yeah.
Anything else to say specifically about the common heritage concept? I have some other concepts from your work that I wanted to get you to talk about before we get to trade-offs, which is my hobby horse.
Yeah, maybe just briefly to sort of sum up, I think both the benefit and the challenge of common heritage is that it is open-ended. It can mean different things to different peoples, where, in the sort of 70s, 80s, especially those in favor of the new economic order would say, oh, it's been co-opted by the market-oriented industrialized states. The benefit of having an open-ended concept is also that today we can again reevaluate it and reinterpret it in light of today's knowledge and today's circumstances and realities, and still attach those arguments to that hook that we have in the law. So it has benefits as well as risks, obviously, depending on what your preferred interpretation is. But as a concept in itself, it doesn't tell you an awful lot until you zoom in on how it's actually put into practice. And that's where the real contention sits.
That's super interesting that you can have a vaguely defined concept that can do work. I mean, I've always kind of assumed that in legal theory, having a concept that is vaguely defined is just an inherent problem that you just have to deal with. But it's interesting that there's a value sometimes in that it can get defined in the context over and over, and whatever time frame it kind of needs to adapt to. And so there's something valuable about not exactly pinning everything down in 1994 so that people in 2026 know exactly what they should do. Leave it a little bit open so people in 2026 can argue over what they should do given what we know in 2026.
Yeah, and it's really common. I think our whole discipline thrives on vaguely defined concepts, right? It's also the nature of compromise. Often the way to get a compromise is to leave certain things unspecified. And international negotiations is making compromises. It's reaching consensus, which is not unanimity. It's the lack of explicit objection. So partly it's strategic. Sometimes it's just a feature of whatever the power constellations at the time was. And sometimes it's deliberate because you cannot know what you cannot know and what you might need to know in 30 years' time or what might happen then. So a degree of flexibility is also beneficial for the longevity of some concepts. Yeah.
Okay. Another thing I picked up from reading some of your work was this concept of the epistemology of crisis, which I think is super relevant to the deep sea mining discussion. It's something that I think listeners will have an intuitive grasp of, that a lot of the talk, a lot of the narrative, a lot of the motivation towards various kind of claims in deep sea mining has this aspect of urgency. We have to either do this now for whatever reason, or we have to stop this now because the threat is real and immediate. And so, yeah, tell me about the epistemology of crisis, and is that your term? What does it do? What's it about?
No, it's not my term, not at all. I drew specifically, I think, on the work of Kyle White, who discusses this concept in the context of climate change. where you see this as well. So that sits roughly in like critical development and indigenous studies, where it basically speaks about ways of understanding the world that frame the current moment, in whatever context that may be, as urgent and unprecedented. And what you then get is argumentative structures that say we need to act now to get us from A to B now. And the way to get there, yes, it may have negative implications and costs, but that's then sort of justified as an inevitable trade-off because we need to get from A to B urgently. The broader critique that underpins that says, well, that's a very familiar pattern in colonial histories and presents where that kind of argument is used to justify deeply harmful, violent, extractivist practices. And I think the contrast there is made, or at least this is what White does in his work, is to contrast that with different ways of understanding the world, which are more relational and that say, well, actually change is constant. And if you want to bolster and understand the ability of a society to adapt to change or respond to change that's preempted, what you really need to look at is the relational structures of how you get to A to B. So responsibility, care, reciprocity, that facilitate a system that can take everyone along from A to B in a way that does not replicate those harms that the critique speaks to. So that's very abstract. I think in the context of seabed mining,
hold on, sorry, I have to jump in and reiterate that one thing about change being constant, because my kind of expected follow-up question is, but aren't we in a crisis? And we do, I mean, across so many aspects, there's this poly-crisis or meta-crisis that people, at least in environmental circles, are focusing a lot on. And so to say that when you act urgently, you can make mistakes and you can justify things that actually maybe shouldn't be justified is all well and good until you have to come up with an alternative. So I thought that point about change is constant was interesting and valuable to kind of highlight that. Yeah, of course, we're in a crisis now, but we've been in lots of crises before, and things are constantly changing.
No, I think that's a really good question. And we are in a crisis. We are in many crises. We're in a crisis, I think, in how we relate to the living world and how we relate to each other. We're in a crisis of the imagination as far as I'm concerned as well. I think what this point speaks to, or what the critique speaks to, is rather being mindful that our response to the crisis doesn't become part of the crisis or causes the next crisis. So that we think about how do we frame the problem actually? Because often that's assumed or imposed, but how do we actually understand the problem? And that informs how we look at responses to that problem. And can we think of responses that do not perpetuate the social and environmental injustices that have left us in crisis A and that we're trying to not replicate into our destination B? So I think it's sort of a pause and then actually let's unpick what's going here. I think it's a different way of looking at it. It's not to deny that we're not in a crisis, but I think it's an invitation to think about how we get out of crisis A and to destination B in a different, hopefully better way.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, it sounds sort of common sense. If you've ever kind of if you've ever tried to help someone who's been in a crisis, the best advice that they sometimes need is just, okay, hold on, take a breath, slow down, let's think about what the actual best thing to do is, all things considered, without rushing. People in crisis mode and panic mode are kind of keen to make the first decision that they can and get out of the crisis. So that's what I've taken so far here, is that the epistemology of crisis is okay, let's slow down and not make bad decisions without getting our head up and seeing what all the options are. But then what's the relational piece of this? What are the alternative ways of looking at the problems that we can use? Because I heard you say also that the relational outlook is something that ties in here, and that's something else that I think I had planned to ask you about later, but maybe it's the same thing.
So that's quite prominent in my current work and thinking. I think the starting point is and this is where my interest as a lawyer as well, is to look at what work particular narratives do. And urgency is an interesting one, and the urgency is used both by, say, the industry camp, and by maybe the sort of the NGO environmental protection camp, but to different ends and for different purposes. So that's one thing. I'm sort of interested in what work those kind of, and what argumentative structures that then leads to. Relational approaches or relational ways of looking at the world, I think, are helpful because it helps us to step out of the sort of yo-yo between anthropocentric approaches and ecocentric approaches, right? Anthropocentric very simply being instrumental values. What use is this to humans, either to use it or to protect it? Whereas ecocentric approaches are much more, no, nature, we need to put a fence around it, leave it be. We need to protect it for its own intrinsic value. I'm oversimplifying now, but this is roughly, often they're opposed or they're contrasted to each other. But what they have in common is that they're both based on the worldview that is very widespread, which is the dualistic worldview of humans and the natural environment or society and nature as separate. Relational approaches or epistemologies or ontologies, you can stick all the difficult words on there, just have a fundamentally different starting point that is a non-dualistic worldview. So they're an umbrella term for ways of seeing, being in the world that views humans, society, and ecosystems as complexly enmeshed, as entangled, as mutually dependent, and kind of shaping each other. And so that moves you away from the ecocentric and anthropocentric dichotomy, and it centers a whole wide range of different values. Often there's an emphasis on reciprocity, on responsibility, on care, and it's much more closely aligned to why people actually look after their environment. So there's fascinating sort of empirical social science that goes and asks people working in conservation around the world, why do you look after this forest or this resource? And very few of them cite either intrinsic or instrumental values. Often it means something to their family, or they grew up there, or it gives them meaningful or pleasure or relaxation or whatever the case may be, a whole range of different values that you could all call relational. Something to do about the interaction with that space rather than just being instrumental or intrinsic. And that just centers a different set of approaches to decision making, to governance. You can sort of scale it up. We can talk about that later. But I think that the core is that it has that different starting point in how we look at how we relate to and with our environment as complexly entangled.
Yeah, that's fascinating because it is, I see more and more talk about a relational approach in whatever literature. And I haven't dug into what it means really, but I can see how it's looking at a different part of the problem than the instrumental versus inherent value of nature. It's like, okay, because it sounds like you could map a lot of what the relational approach does onto it, either an instrumental or an intrinsic worldview. It's just like, you know what, actually that end value isn't super important for solving the immediate problem, which I think is often the criticism that a lot of people have of philosophers, of a lot of the abstract environmental debate, is that you're not really dealing with substance, you're not dealing with the context, you're not dealing with the nuance, you're not addressing the real problems, you're not addressing why people are doing things. So it's interesting that by focusing on a different part of the problem without completely throwing away the unresolved end state of the problem, you can just get more progress. So this sounds like it's a more pragmatic, practical approach to making progress on environmental issues.
Yeah, I think, and it actually goes back to a lot that we used to know, but maybe I've forgotten, not in all parts of the world. There's a huge resurgence of relational approaches, which I'm sure everyone can find really close to home, whether it's local food cooperatives, bits of farmland or land. Here in Scotland, we have a big movement for communities to buy back land and look after that on their own terms, whether that's managing and restoring a forest or owning the renewable energy system on their island or whatever the case may be. All of those are examples of relational approaches to managing land or resources or common good. And I think on a small scale, that's very intuitive. It's probably just something we do and we care about and get involved in without even thinking about it in those terms. Now, of course, that gets a lot more complex when you want to scale that up to something like the international of the seabed beyond national jurisdiction, which is very big and very far away for most people. But some of those principles, I think we can nevertheless take inspiration from, both as a lens through which to look at some of the things that aren't working so well, and as a way to think towards alternative ways of doing that and alternative ways of structuring our relationships with that place. And the bigger variety of values that I'm sure are vested in there.
Okay, so then now I've got to, before I run out of time, ask you about how we solve trade-off problems. So this is something that I have been trying to ask most people who come on the podcast, is some version of the question of, given the common framing of deep sea mining as implicating different sets of values. Often it's simplistically framed as environmental versus human welfare or economic values. And how do we make decisions where we have to make trade-offs between things that are in different value categories? Tell me about how you look at the framing of trade-offs, and tell me how I should be asking this question for the deep sea mining debate so that it's useful and valuable and going to elicit interesting, helpful understanding.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to give an answer that solves all your questions here. Probably not.
And makes my future research much easier. If you can just also contribute a little bit to my PhD dissertation while you're at it, I would really appreciate that.
I think the first thing I would say, there's nothing wrong with the tool of a trade-off. In essence, it makes dealing with complexity and how we deal with that transparent to the degree that you can show in a trade-off what has been traded off and what the end result is. And it's really common in environmental decision-making, also on regional, local levels. Where I think it is problematic is if we default to a trade-off as the sort of formula that will get us to an outcome, to a decision, without looking at what happens before that. So we're trading off certain interests or values in a particular context, but often they are sort of pre-assumed or pre-assigned, sometimes even in law. This is not so much the case in the deep seabed, although you have those three buckets of competing interests. And there are many assumptions made there. So we think of mineral commercial exploitation, then we think of environmental risk as something that will probably manage currently sort of two strands. There's a compensation fund, so you pay in, and the other mechanism, roughly, I'm simplifying, is to put certain areas aside from mining. So we're making all sorts of assumptions about equivalence of extraction, and that you can compensate for that in terms of setting aside other areas or in monetary terms. And then in terms of benefit, we attach a percentage to the value of a nodule, and that's paid to the ISA and then distributed. So there's all sorts of interests and values that are simplified in particular ways. And that part, how that simplification, how that sort of value creation and interest generation comes about, is it often not even part of a political or deliberative process. It's sort of pre-assumed. And that's where I think if we rely on trade-offs to solve our problems without actually looking at a deliberative process of value and interest formation, you're only seeing a tiny part of the picture, and you're probably not even getting to where the real challenges and the real controversies, but also the potential solutions and compromises sit. So an emphasis, again, on whether you want to call it relational approaches or how do you formulate something like a public interest in, for example, the deep seabed. Ideally, you want to have a broader and more inclusive deliberative process that actually gives rise to the interest or values that you're then going to negotiate and potentially trade off on. But I think you need to look at that, a big part that sits before you actually get to the trade-off as well.
Yeah, interesting. So you've taken my question and you've made it much more complicated in that not only do we need to come up with a way to make decisions when it involves trade-offs between different values, but we also have to be explicit and intentional and transparent about how we come to determine what the things we're trading off against each other are.
Yeah. And I think where certainly at the international level that often feels counterintuitive is a lot of the way, so if you want to call it global governance or the management through international organizations or of international shared resources like the deep seabed has become quite a sort of technocratic exercise. And trade-offs sort of fit in that idea of, we just have some tools and some levers and you plug in the information and then the outcome comes out of this exercise. Whereas actually they're deeply political questions, they're highly complex questions, and there's probably a much wider range of values that are not necessarily being accounted for. So it's also a move to basically repoliticize some of these questions and not assume them as a given, which sits uncomfortable with some people, but it's also like it's proven that tends to generate more equitable outcomes. Give what example? The IPBES, which is kind of the IPCC equivalent for biodiversity policy, published its values assessment report a few years ago, and they recommend that actually deliberative processes that grapple with a wider range of values tend to result in more socially and environmentally just outcomes, and therefore more sustainable as well, because you have buy-in of a bigger population of actors. So there's evidence around that from smaller scales. The challenge is, how do you bring that to an international scale? But we're seeing some small movements in that direction. I think an interesting example in the ISA is the work led by Micronesia and others on cultural heritage, tangible and intangible, and how that should be factored into those three components of the mandate and into the regulations, and that speaks also of cultural heritage and spiritual ties, so things that are difficult to quantify and difficult to trade off, but trying to start and think through ways to weigh that in. So there's definitely little openings that are being exploited, and there's slowly, I think, a movement to diversifying what's being represented in those discussions, at least initially.
So there's a counterintuitive aspect to that, in that you can make somehow better progress by complicating the question. I mean, the cleanest version of trade-off logic is just kind of cost-benefit analysis. If we can put a dollar value onto things and then sum those things up and choose the alternative that has the best value, and there are kind of rational ways to put dollar values on things, there's a whole discipline around that is less problematic than you might think, or even if we assume that those dollar values are somehow accurately arrived at. And then what you're saying is there's evidence that if we try to step back from that more simplistic framing and do a much more complicated process, that we might end up at somehow a more tractable outcome. I think that is, it's not obvious that would be the case. That I would have thought there was a tension between doing processes that are too complicated versus overly simplistic processes that at least get you to an outcome. So it's interesting if sometimes the overly complicated process does get you to an outcome that is maybe a better outcome. That would be optimistic.
Yeah, or maybe the going through the complicated process can get you to a point where you can agree on a simplified way of on a trade-off model or a cost-benefits analysis of the values that you've generated through the difficult process that has, first of all, buy-in, but also that has a reflective component attached to it, so that you monitor how that then actually pans out in practice. And this is important, I think, for the successful examples on a local scale, that there's sort of a feedback loop, so that you can go back and learn and say, okay, well, we tried that didn't work out so well, so what do we adjust? So that there's a sort of a constant learning process. And again, that's not something that we're incapable of doing. There's already a bazillion ways of organizing that. But I think bringing that combination of approaches together is key. And I think we all have to get a little bit more comfortable with messiness and complexity maybe as well.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, I think I have exactly used up the amount of time that I had you scheduled for. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like to discuss? Anything that you're currently working on that you would like to share about if you've got a few more minutes?
I currently have a project on global commons. So not just the deep seabed, but all these big faraway spaces that we tend to think of as global commons, oceans, Antarctica, outer space, funded by the Leverhulme Trust. And I'm looking at the role of international organizations in sort of making and unmaking and shaping what happens in those spaces. And I'm bringing some of the law and legal thinking there into conversation with lessons from commons practice and commons theory. Basically, again, relational approaches of various kinds. So there will be some work forthcoming on that, including with nods to the deep sea bed. So very much in line with some of the themes we've touched on today.
Okay, well, I'm going to leave aside digging into that. Then my standard wrap-up questions. Where do you send people who want to know more about any of these things? Is there somewhere that is worth, if I wanted to know more about common heritage, interested deep sea mining follower, where would you send me?
I can send you the link to the Pardo speech. It's quite interesting to read and to contrast that to what we're talking about today. I can also recommend the quite sort of deep and historical work of my colleague Surabhi Ranganathan at Cambridge on the history of common heritage in the deep seabed regime. I can send you a link to that as well. More broadly on how law and environmental law deals with value offsets, trade-offs. I can also recommend the work by Julia Dim, who writes more in the context of climate change, but I think on similar principles, and also scholars that sort of straddle disciplinary boundaries, as we discussed.
Okay, well, that's great. If you send me those links, we'll put them into the show notes, and I will also use them in my own research and understanding of this topic. Where can people follow you, keep up with your work? Are you active on social media? Do you have a presence somewhere?
Probably best place is LinkedIn. I can't say I'm super active, but if I remember, if there's something new or interested out, I will share it there. Or you can find me on the University of Edinburgh staff page as well.
Awesome. Okay, well then thanks everybody for sticking with us through this podcast. Thanks for taking an interest in deep sea mining. Thanks, Roze, for being here and for walking me through all of this and answering all of my personal questions for these topics. It's been a pleasure and an education.
Likewise, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.